Hello. Today we are going to begin a three-part series on the reliability of the Bible. In this three-week series, we're going to focus in particular on the Gospels, although obviously we could have a much more wide-ranging discussion beyond that over time. But again, for these first 3 weeks, we'll focus in particular on the Gospels. So for today's topic, we are going to look at the origins of the Gospels. How did we get the Gospels that we have today, and why should we consider them to be reliable? So the claim that I want us to challenge is this idea that's out there that the Gospels are unreliable sources for telling us about the real historical Jesus. And the reason people would claim this is they would say that human memory, after all, makes mistakes passing down tradition orally. After all, if Jesus died around 30 and the Gospels weren't written down until at the earliest in the 60s, there's more than 3 decades of time that pass between Jesus' death and the writing of the Gospels, when traditions about Jesus would have been passed down orally. And they argue there would have been plenty of opportunities, kind of like in a game of telephone, for the stories about Jesus to have changed over time. Um, and not only that, some would claim, but some would argue that in fact, some Christians changed the stories about Jesus deliberately, that in reality, they had no reason to preserve the true traditions about Jesus, but instead, they argue, Jesus' followers simply made up or created stories about Jesus that help them meet their own needs in their own time. So those are the claims that some people will make about the Gospels and why they're unreliable. And so the point that I want to argue in this video is that in fact the Gospels are reliable. And we could argue this from a number of different ways, but the one that we'll focus on today is that the Gospels should be considered reliable because there were eyewitnesses who were both the sources of the gospel traditions and who guaranteed that it was accurately transmitted. So it's the presence of these eyewitnesses that guarantees the reliability of the Gospels. So let's unpack that idea. On the one hand, we have what we might call direct evidence. Direct evidence. So things that are explicitly stated either within the Bible or by Christians in the following decades and centuries. So within the Bible itself, note how Luke, writing his gospel and Acts, he claims to receive his traditions directly from eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and teachings. Most famously in Luke 1:1-4, but also he refers to these people who had been present with Jesus from the beginning in Acts chapter 1, verses 21-22. Outside of the Bible, a very important church father named Papias, who wrote around 110, so very, very early source here. His writings were preserved by the church historian Eusebius. Papias recounts that the oral traditions of the words and deeds of Jesus were in fact attached to named eyewitnesses. So he talks about what we know as the Gospel of Mark. He says that Mark was the interpreter of the disciple Peter. And so the gospel traditions associated with Mark are in fact from Peter. Likewise, he says Matthew recorded the oracles of the Lord in Hebrew. Scholars fight over exactly what this means. But point being, as early as 110, we have Christians identifying bodies of tradition about Jesus. We would call them the Gospels, with named eyewitnesses. In 150, Justin Martyr, very important church father, identifies the Gospel of Mark as the memoirs of Peter. 185, Irenaeus says that Polycarp, a follower of John, had conversed with Jesus's disciples and had memorized their words. So again, it's this notion that Jesus' disciples actually lived, right, in many cases for several decades after his death, resurrection, and ascension, and that they taught all they knew to their followers. So in this case, John taught what he knew to Polycarp. And finally, something called the Muratorian Canon in 200 gives us Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors of the four Gospels that continue to bear their names. So we have this direct evidence from the Christian tradition. On the other hand, we also have what we might call indirect evidence. In other words, if we look at the Gospels themselves, there's lots of features that seem to suggest that they are based on eyewitness testimony. So for example, the many Gospel stories that involve named characters. The Gospels are very specific in assigning names to people in many of the stories. And this suggests that many of these people were, in fact, well known in the Christian communities. And this, in fact, could explain some of the vivid details in the Gospels. So when the Gospels have these intensely personal stories, for instance, the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19, perhaps this is on account of the fact that Zacchaeus was a known figure in the early Christian communities. He was himself an eyewitness to this story that is now being retold, in this case, in the Gospel of Luke. Likewise, if we do a close reading of Mark's Gospel and the literary features associated with it, we can reconstruct that Peter was likely its primary eyewitness source. So in other words, the internal evidence of the Gospel coheres with the external attributions about Peter being the ultimate source of Mark's Gospel. Likewise, with John's Gospel, a close reading of its literary features suggests that its author was likewise present at key points in the story of Jesus. And again, this could explain some of the very vivid details in the sections where the author is present. So, for instance, at the cross in John 19, 31 to 37, appears to reflect the author's eyewitness accounts. So we have then both direct and indirect evidence suggesting that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony. So why then are the Gospels ultimately written down if they were first passed down orally? Well, I think what makes the most sense is that the Gospels were written down in order to preserve this eyewitness testimony at the time when the eyewitnesses were dying off. So one of the ways in which the ancient world was very different from our modern world is that the ancient world actually believed oral tradition to be much more reliable than things that were written down. Papias talks about how he preferred a living voice over that of a book. And the reason for that is an actual person. You could vouch for their character and integrity, and if they had been an eyewitness, whereas a book, you don't necessarily know anything about the author. So the ancient world actually preferred for tradition to be handed down orally rather than written down. So it would make sense that in the first decades of Christianity, these things were not written down because people would have preferred to consult Peter or John or the other eyewitnesses. And note that the early Christians handed down these traditions in an oral manner that was not like a game of telephone. Rather, it was formal and controlled, and it was safeguarded by the continued presence of the eyewitnesses. So Paul refers to this in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 3, when he talks about the traditions of Jesus' life having been handed over to him. It's this process of memorization. And in the ancient world, when people didn't have Wikipedia and smartphones to just pull up facts whenever they wanted, memorization was much more important. People were capable of memorizing um, to a much greater extent than people are today. It's a skill that I believe we've lost. And so there was this formal process of handing over tradition, of having it be formally memorized. And then over time, that memorization was preserved, it was safeguarded by the continued presence of the eyewitnesses. Ultimately, though, the eyewitnesses begin to die off. In the 60s, with the persecution under Nero, for instance, Peter and Paul are both martyred under Nero traditionally. So as the eyewitnesses are beginning to die off, this creates the need to now write down what had previously been passed down orally. Yes, you may prefer to consult the eyewitness yourself, but if they're dead, this would be a great opportunity to then write it down. So just take Mark's gospel. So if it's true that Peter was martyred in the mid-60s under Nero, most scholars date Mark's gospel to the late 60s or maybe early 70s. So it would be shortly after Peter's death. So it would make a great deal of sense on this theory. So I think that's what's going on. I think that explains why the Gospels are not written down immediately, but why they do end up getting written down in the 60s or 70s. So for our discussion, I want you to think about if you had a friend who challenged you on the reliability of the Gospels and says that, well, oral tradition, you can't trust it. It's like a game of telephone where the story constantly changes. How would you respond to that classmate or that friend? Then I want us to focus in on the Gospel of Mark and consider Peter's portrayal. So if it's true that Peter is the source of Mark's Gospel, go back and think about how Peter is portrayed in Mark's Gospel. Hint, it's not super great. Now I want us to think about why would Peter portray himself this way if he is indeed the source of Mark's Gospel. So I hope to see you on the discussion. Please leave a comment or a question as well on the YouTube page. And if you're interested in this topic in more detail, most of this presentation I've based on Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. It's a bit of an academic book, but it's really powerful in its argument. And so if you're interested, I'd recommend checking that out.